Every question we ask can build confidence in the capital markets, can help our clients grow, innovators accelerate, governments solve more complex challenges, and communities to thrive. All of these better questions on a huge scale make a dramatic difference to our people, clients, communities, and to the whole ocean of global economics. Every better answer helps us achieve our purpose of building a better working world. And the question that you ask is the drop that starts the ripple.
Oh, thank you. Well, hello, Randy. How are you? Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I can see you at the entrance. Come on in. There's plenty of seats. We've got seating here in first class, plenty in coach, obviously. Come on in and make yourselves comfortable. The screens, by the way, people, there's nothing on the screens, just so you know, at the back of the room. Welcome. My name is Mark Jeffries, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this fabulous event. Here we are. It's the EY World Entrepreneur of the Year event, and we are so excited to have you all here in Monaco. I'm Mark Jeffries. This is what I do for a living. I host events all over the world. EY is a great client of mine, and this is probably why, I think maybe fourth time in Monaco, and I absolutely love it. But you know, one thing I've learned over the years of hosting and speaking at conferences, and for those of you who have to stand up in front of your own teams quite often, or perhaps in front of people who are looking to back or finance you, the one thing I've learned is every audience, no matter who they are, always splits into 3 categories. Did you know that? 3 categories. And those 3 categories, regardless of who they are always the same. You have your learners, your vacationers, and your prisoners every time. And you can tell just by looking at them. The learners, they're sitting forward, they've got notebooks out, iPads ready, they want to learn something from you. And you know them in your teams back at base, they just look to you for inspiration, they're so excited. Then you have the vacationers. The vacationers are sitting halfway back in the room. They're leaning back on their chair and they're saying to each other, well, I guess it's better than, you know, sitting at my desk. They're the vacationers. They haven't quite made up their mind. They're sitting on the fence. And then finally, the prisoners. And we know what they look like as well. Normally at the back of the room, arms crossed, their eyes are rolling. They already hate you and you haven't started yet. This is a difficult audience member to deal with. But let me tell you, as great leaders that you are, you know that you only have one task when you stand up in front of an audience: give them what they want. Give the learners what they came for, show the vacationers that they are not on holiday, and at least get the prisoners to perhaps uncross their arms just once, and you've won that audience. So that's one thing that I've learned in the years that I've been lucky enough to stand on stages in front of great audiences like you. You know, we have a fabulous couple of days set up for all of you, all leading up to the gala on Saturday night, when we will learn who amongst our 59 winners sitting right here in this room will be the 2017 EY World Entrepreneur of the Year. By the way, you know, when we set this up, we have everything in place to really help you. So to help you navigate around and interact with our event, make sure that you download the WEOY mobile app. So you have to have on your phone the EY Events app. If you go into the EY, you should do this now, by the way, because we're going to do a little test. Go into the EY Events app and find our actual event, which is WEOY 2017. By now, you should have that. It's very easy to use. You won't miss a minute of what's going on. And by the way, I know you all run huge, fabulous businesses, but if you need any assistance, you've got some choices. You could always consult with our help desk near registration, or you could do what I do with an app. Just keep pressing things until it works. I find that to be very successful on the whole. So key information that you might need if you're literally downloading it right now, the username and password. The username in this app is your registration email. So however you registered for this event, the email address you used, that is your username. And the password is WEOY 2017. All caps, all one unit. There you go. So that's how you get in. If you're going to tweet your ideas and thoughts at this event, and by the way, we encourage you to do this, because let me tell you this, social media, it's happening. For a long time, people were not sure, should I not? It's happening, it's huge. And you know, everyone's tweeting right now, sad. So the hashtag that you need to use every time you tweet anything about our event so that we can follow you and follow your conversation and your ideas is hashtag WEOY. That's it. That's our hashtag. Make sure you use that in all your tweets. Now, in the app, thank you, Randy, we have an app-based polling feature this year so that we can get your opinions, your input, and all you have to do is access the polling on the app. So turn to the section in the app, opening remarks. So basically, you look at the agenda, click on agenda. In the agenda, you'll see my name, Mark Jeffries, and opening remarks. Click on that. And when you're there, go to the bottom right-hand side, and you will see open poll. So click on the open poll right now. This is how you can actually see our first poll. It's just a test. Herb, delightful to see you. And Deborah, delightful to see you as well. Now, you've got to name check people. Eventually, I will get everybody. So you click on that, and we're going to get our first question of the day. This is a test question just to familiarize yourself with how the app works and for us to see if it actually works. So here we go. The question is, what is Monaco most famous for in your own mind? Here are the choices. They should be on your app as well. Is it the Grand Prix? Perhaps Casino Royale? Maybe the Grimaldi family? Is it AS Monaco, the tennis tournament? Or is it choice E, large piles of cash? Or choice F, Grace Kelly? What do you think? Make your decision right now by using the app. Click on what you believe is most important in terms of what makes Monaco famous. I'll give you a few seconds on this one. And let's have a look if we get some results. Okay, so if we're able to, let's put some results on the screen. Let's see those results. We've got a team running this app, and I'm looking at the screen waiting to see if results come up. Well, they'll come up in a moment, and let's carry on. There we go. So far, Grand Prix seems to be what Monaco is most famous for. What do you reckon? You agree with that? The casino, not bad, but large piles of cash at 19%. I'm with you on that, and of course, Grace Kelly. Great. All right, so the app works, and that's how it works. You know, this year, the overarching question that we're asking at our 17th annual EY World Entrepreneur of the Year is, could uncertainty be your best opportunity for growth? And my goodness, do we live in uncertain times? Today alone, we have the UK general election. Do we have any Brits in the audience? Brits, did you vote? Yeah, good. Okay, I'll come and talk to you about that afterwards. We also have the Jim Comey testimony in the United States. It's like a soap opera. The United States is my home country now, and literally every day it is like another event is taking place, and you can't take your eyes off it. But what's key is that there is uncertainty, because none of us know what's going to happen next. So through panel discussions, debates, keynote interviews, and interactive crowd-solving sessions, we'll explore how the world's most dynamic entrepreneurs, that's you guys, renowned for your ability to find new opportunities, even in times of unprecedented change, how they continue to grow and thrive. We'll hear your stories. We'll hear great stories on the stage as well. Other questions that our esteemed panelists, guests, and yourselves will be tackling include, how might we navigate the new intersection of politics, economics, business, and society as well? What will we learn from celebrated serial entrepreneur and EY Entrepreneur of the Year winner Mark Cuban? He's here later on this afternoon. Also, what might we learn from Oscar-winning actress, the amazing Kate Winslet will be with us tomorrow, and the global tech CEO Vishal Sikka. They will give us their stories and their answers. And last but not least, my number one question. In the workerless workforce of the future, might I be replaced by a robot? A beautiful, bald robot with an English accent? Maybe. It might happen, but we will find out how likely that is later on this morning. So let's begin. To get our event off to a fine start, we are absolutely delighted to welcome to the stage EY's Global Growth Markets leader. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Annette Kimmitt.
Have fun. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monaco. It's so great to have you all here. I'm really thrilled to be here to celebrate with you our EY 17th EY World Entrepreneur of the Year, recognising, supporting and celebrating entrepreneurship country winners in this audience are going to be inducted into the EY Entrepreneur of the Year Hall of Fame. So no wonder we're here to celebrate you and your legacy. Now, it has nothing to do with how old you are. It has nothing to do with the age of your company, but it has everything to do with your purpose and your impact on business and the wider world around you. So could I please ask all of our country winners for 2017 who are here today to please stand up so we can recognise you. Don't be shy, stand up. Congratulations. Now, you should be aware, congratulations, thank you. Now, many of them will be hunkered down over at the Hermitage going through judging at the moment, so they're all furiously preparing for their interviews with the judges. Now, before we start the program, I did want to share with you how you and your peers from all over the world are already helping to influence the agenda and discussions we're going to be having here over the next few days. Between the end of March and the middle of May this year, we conducted the largest ever global survey of mid-market leaders. We really wanted to try to better understand their strategies for accelerating growth in these times of real uncertainty. And the result is the EY Growth Barometer. And you can check your app, which I know Mark just took you through. You can check your app to find out much more about it. But you can also take a closer look at the results using the interactive EY Growth Barometer display out in the foyer, and that visualises some of the key data and our findings. But if you're really interested to dig deep, you can go onto our EY Better Working World Hub. The URL's up there. We've actually made all of the data available open source, so you can go in there and play with it. So do go and have a look on the Better Working World Hub. Now, the survey covered nearly 2,400 respondents from around the world, and those respondents were geographically representative of contribution to global GDP. So we're really confident that this survey gives a really great reflection of global sentiment from leaders. But we also invited our global network of EY Entrepreneur of the Year alumni to take the survey. And so what we wanted to talk about and share with you was some of the things that leaders around the world told us about. Now, what they told us was that despite global uncertainty, the geopolitical risks that we're all facing, you all remain really confident in your ability to grow through those challenges. And what was most astonishing was that 90% of all respondents told us that they see today's uncertainty as grounds for growth opportunities, which is incredible. More than half of the respondents told us that they plan to grow in the next 12 months by more than 6%, and 1 in 7 told us that they plan to grow by more than 16% in the next 12 months. Now, these are far more significant than the World Bank's latest global GDP forecast of 2.7%. But what was most interesting was that our Entrepreneur of the Year alumni are even more ambitious in their growth projections over the next 12 months, with more than 1 in 4 believing they will achieve growth over the next year of more than 26%, which is just phenomenal. But we also asked about what might stand in the way of that growth. What we learned was that it's not the usual culprits like insufficient cash flow or sluggish demand. What leaders called out was the lack of skilled talent and technology disruption as the top 2 challenges they face. But really interestingly, they also called out technology and talent as the top 2 most important factors to remaining innovative, to remaining agile, and being able to seize the upside of disruption. So you'll be really pleased to know that you're going to be able to attend sessions today addressing both of those critical issues, talent and disruptive technologies. Now, speaking of disruptive technologies, Mark Jeffries, you'll be very pleased to know that of those organisations that are already using technologies like robotic process automation or RPA and artificial intelligence, the focus of those technologies is all about process-driven work. driving efficiency. They're generally not looking to replace humans, but rather to take the process work away from humans to free them up to focus on the more creative elements of driving innovation. So it doesn't look like robots will spell the end of human talent. Maybe not yet. So we'll see. But you'll hear more about this in our Workforce of the Future session during the conference. Now, over the next few days, we've got panels and we've got active crowd-solving sessions, and they're all designed to provide you with actionable insights on everything from mentoring talent through to digital transformation. So now it's time to get started, and let's start really big. I'm going to welcome out onto the stage in just a moment my colleague Jon Shames, along with his panel. Jon leads EY's Geostrategic Services team, and he's going to moderate what I know will be a really fascinating discussion that will help us all make real sense of the economic, the political, the business and the social changes that are swirling all around us today. These things are coming together to create the perfect storm for entrepreneurs to flourish and to grow despite all of the uncertainty. So please have a great few days. I look forward to meeting many of you, but join me in welcoming Jon Shames out onto the stage. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Jon, break a leg.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. This is my first time in Monaco, and I'm excited to be able to enjoy this next couple days. You know, I think in the first two people who got up here, they talked about change, they talked about uncertainty, and we're going to dive right into that. I mean, these are interesting times. I mean, no matter where you live, you open up your paper or check the internet every day, and there's just all these things that are confusing, and really we're going to try to dive into that, untangle those, and discuss them. I've got two great panelists, and I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to dive right in. So Dr. Pippa Malmgren is the founder of the DPRM Group and also co-founder of Robotics, a company that makes drones. She's the author of the recently published bestseller Signals, and she also has a geopolitical book out there that was published a couple years ago. DPRM Group is an economics advisory firm established to help global firms understand the economic landscape. She is currently advising the British government on Brexit-related matters and also served as a presidential advisor to George W. Bush in the U.S. and at the same time served on the National Economic Council. Welcome, Pippa. Kevin Kajiwara is co-president of Teneo Intelligence, providing the largest financial and corporate firms with insights on geopolitical and policy risks, as well as their implications on investment decisions and corporate strategy. Kevin plays an active role in promoting the firm's research agenda and developing its macro views, in addition to working closely with Teneo, which is a CEO advisory firm. Teneo has been working closely with EY over the past number of months on a variety of geopolitical related matters. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Jon.
So I got up this morning and I read the paper and I noticed the following things that have all taken place in the last week that you would argue have some geopolitical relationship. The isolation of Qatar by certain Arab states, terrorism in Iran, the British election going on today, terrorism in London last week, the French election of Macron and the parliamentary elections going on right now, James Comey hearing today in the U.S., U.S. pulling out of the Paris Accord on climate change, and finally, North Korea yet again launching some missiles. So that's what we're dealing with right now, unprecedented change, confusion. What do you do about it? And before we dive into that, I really want to ask a simple question, because as I took on this role in the firm, people always ask me the same thing. What is geopolitics? I mean, that's in the paper every single day. You see that name more and more. What does that really mean? And so I'm going to turn this over to our panel, and Pippa, why don't you start? But how do you view geopolitics?
Yeah, when I was growing up, they used to call it international relations. But these days, I guess it has a strategic security, potentially military edge to it when you add the word geopolitics. Because it's more than just politics gone international. It kind of implies a need for diplomacy. We were at dinner last night and saying, you know, when you talk about American relations with Ecuador, nobody says geopolitics. It's only when there's a strategic security angle. But I do think it's very interesting that Henry Kissinger has said that this is the most challenging period in international relations since the Second World War.
Okay. Kevin?
Well, I agree with all of that, and I would just add that, you know, what's interesting right now is that geopolitics is, as Pippa suggests, in play. The last time that geopolitics was in play to this degree was the end of the Soviet Union. But the difference is that it was pretty obvious at that point who the winner was, right? The winner was the United States and the regulated free market, the primacy of the multinational corporation, and effectively globalization, that championing of the regulated free market and taking advantage of global labor rate differentials, global economies of scale, global supply chains. If you got that right, you were going to win. This time around, I think it's not nearly as obvious who the winners are, as the United States goes through a period of relative hegemonic decline, partly by design, partly due to the fact that there's a rise of other actors like China as an example. But the United States still has unquestioned military dominance, but we're also moving into a world where there's great disruption on that front as well. You can see you don't need to spend 4% of GDP to be able to challenge the United States militarily, either in a very low-tech way, terrorism, or in a very high-tech way. The battlefield of the 21st century is going to be in cyberspace, and it doesn't take a lot of money. The barrier to entry on that is actually quite low. So, and technology as a disruptor itself is starting to blur the lines of the sovereign state, the sort of Westphalian concept of the sovereign state. So the point is that we're in a period of flux, and the winners are not necessarily as obvious as they were the last time around.
And so at the beginning, I talked about a lot of different geopolitical events. Do you guys consider those geopolitical events, or are there some that are more important than others in your mind?
Yeah, and actually the one I think that's most important, especially for entrepreneurs, you didn't even mention, which is China has just held this huge event announcing their strategy, their grand strategy called One Belt, One Road, and as of last week, One Circle. And this is the build out of massive infrastructure, ports, airports, railway links. We now have a railway that goes from eastern China all the way to London in 18 days. They can cross the Arctic, which is their One Circle strategy, in 26 days. The strategic security elements of One Belt, One Road are very important because it is seen to be potentially more than just a commercial issue, but a strategic security issue for the West. And just to be clear about how big a deal this is, you know, President Obama and Xi Jinping signed a memorandum of understanding over a year ago where each side committed to prevent their military pilots from quite literally making obscene hand gestures at each other while flying. You're like, how close do you have to be to see the other guy's obscene hand gesture in a fighter jet? And the answer is way too close. And we are seeing many, many events like this. So another thing you didn't mention, but I think is important, is constant near misses now between Russian and Japanese aircraft, constant near misses between American and Chinese, constant near misses between Russian and many NATO member countries. So it's a strategically challenging environment, and I would add that to your list.
Okay, well, thank you. Kevin, any other reactions to that list?
Look, I mean, every one of those things you named on that list are elements have to be considered within the geopolitical context. And Pippa's right. I mean, look, the most important relationship of the 21st century is clearly that between the United States and China. And, you know, typically, historically, you have not seen one country supplant another country as the world's largest economy, which China is in the process of doing, and have that happen in a peaceful way. I would say the United States overtaking the UK is probably the exception that proves the rule on that front. Now, in the 21st century world, in the nuclear world, obviously armed conflict between superpowers is basically unthinkable. So I'm not saying that there's an inherently conflictual issue here between the United States and China, but with all of these issues playing out, and once you go below the tectonic level to the individual issues driving or constraining state actors, is that it leads to suboptimal allocations of capital and labor and the other inputs. And this is what business really needs to consider, because clearly in a world that's growing 1% a year, it's going to take a long time for countries to double their average earnings versus countries that are growing 3% a year. And with China slowing, the United States kind of plugging along, Europe trying to get its act together, Japan trying to reflate itself, there's a lot of challenges to getting growth up, and the inequalities that we've seen emerge and be key factors in elections over the last several years is set to continue.
So let's turn to entrepreneurs and companies. And so obviously this conference is including a number of companies and people who are very, very deep in terms of entrepreneurs. And I'd love to get some reactions of what should they care about. Okay, let's assume that they're mostly global companies. So what are the things that they should be focusing on mostly as companies, as entrepreneurs?
So the first thing is, geopolitics can sound quite daunting and challenging, but traditionally throughout history, geopolitics is a normal part of the risk landscape. In a way, we have a generation that was born after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when billions of new workers entered the world economy and pushed down wages and prices very systematically, but that also eliminated the need to spend a lot of money on defense. And so we have a generation that thinks that this is a normal environment. I would argue we've come to the end of that very lucky period, and it wasn't anything more than just a lucky period. So instead of getting worried about it, accept this is a normal part of the risk landscape. And actually, having some uncertainty creates opportunities. So for example, you mentioned China and the United States challenging each other in a variety of different ways. One of the things I see on the geopolitical landscape comes through this One Belt, One Road strategy, where China develops infrastructure abroad. They have already concluded they are no longer competitive in manufacturing. Wages have gone up so much in China that it simply can't compete even with the United States. The largest Chinese firms are now building in the US, right? Foxconn, that makes our iPhones, 1.2 million employees, has announced their intention to build a production facility in the United States. When Shenzhen is beaten out by Pennsylvania, something big is going on here. And the second piece of that is Mexico has emerged as the new China. Its wages are 30% cheaper, its quality control is American standards. So whereas China deploying a lot of its investment dollars, One Belt, One Road comes to Mexico. New port that will be larger than the port in Long Beach, the biggest port on the west coast of the Americas. Railway links into Kansas City, new refineries. So when you see geopolitics happening, you also have to consider, okay, what does that mean for opportunity where investment dollars move? And we could look at every part of the world in this same way.
Kevin?
Yeah, and I think, look, the bottom line, though, is that what makes the world attractive for an entrepreneur in many ways still hasn't changed through all of this as well. I mean, on the one hand, you do have to keep an eye on where the big trends are going and kind of ignore the noise of the day-to-day news and whether this government or that government is providing a more emollient atmosphere. I mean, things are changing. What Pippa mentioned with regards to One Belt, One Road, but even more importantly, in a secular way, right, is the declining component of labor in manufacturing, as an example, which is allowing for nearshoring and reshoring and the implications that that's going to have for global trade, as an example. Like, these are the types of trends that need to be focused on. However, having said that, critical components that have always been there remain there. And, as we look at a lot of options, I do want to point out that as much as we kind of can get down on the United States oftentimes for what it's been doing or its relative pullback, it still remains a very, very attractive environment, right? Because you've got all of the ingredients, a system that champions the iconoclast, an efficient capital market system, basically from start to finish, from angel investing all the way up to listings on stock exchanges and debt financing. It's got an efficient bankruptcy system. It has got scale. And those things are important and will remain so.
And let's stay on that for a second. So U.S., lots of noise, things happening every day. We read about it in the paper. A lot of investors in the U.S. are, in a way, spooked by what's going on. You know, Kevin, you indicated that that shouldn't probably be as worrisome as it has been. But let's talk about that some more. And Pippa?
Totally. Well, when I look at the landscape from an investment point of view, what I see is central banks all over the world have pushed $18 trillion into the world economy, cash plus low interest rates. And every one of them is telling us we're not going to take it back. I mean, we might do 1 or 2 rate hikes, but we're not actually going to take it back. So this money has to go somewhere. And I think a lot of it is going to end up with this audience. It's going to end up with the entrepreneurs. This is why we see stock markets at all-time record highs. And I find it fascinating all the investors are scared to death because they say, oh my God, it's all-time record high. I'm like, well, whatever definition we had of an all-time record high, it was $18 trillion less than we currently have. So I'm very optimistic that capital is flowing. And again, the geopolitical landscape is so interesting. You mentioned the Comey testimony. And that was my one question, is that really geopolitics? Well, it is, because the President of the United States is so influential and at this particular moment, so controversial. But what I find as an investor, when I step back and look at that situation, it's interesting and ironic that President Trump is very disliked by many, so controversial, and yet the principles that he stands for have all to do with supporting the entrepreneurial element in the economy, right? He's all about smaller government. He's all about less red tape. He's all about lower taxes. And this is why, ironically, you may dislike him, but then the stock market goes up. And I find that globally, what we've got, and if you want to really summarize it, is the biggest geopolitical issue of our time is the debt. And while that's a local issue in every country, it's having global consequences. So the debt is like a wrecking ball that bears down on the social fabric and literally breaks the promises that hold our society together. And since governments can't deliver on their promises because they're broke, they're basically having to tax the citizens more. So what we're witnessing is a shift in the balance of power between citizens and their ability to generate profits and states and their ability to collect tax. And this balance of power is being kind of renegotiated in every part of the world. And I think it does underpin a lot of geopolitics, from the Arab Spring to the forces that want secession, like Brexit, to the forces that want to deliver a better future to the population, and they got to find a way to do it, and that's what the logic is behind China's One Belt, One Road. So these are big drivers.
And you mentioned debt. You know, I mean, there hasn't been much talk about that in the U.S. as much. Europe went through its own issues recently. China has been more in the news lately, and I don't know if you have any reactions to that, but is that something real from too much debt in China that's going to affect them down the road?
Totally. I mean, you can see that basically the debt burden on that society is too high if they want to achieve the goal, which is, Xi Jinping has said, is to double national incomes by 2020, which I find almost impossible to see how that could possibly happen. But frankly, it's an issue in every part of the world. I mean, even in Western Europe, you know, if you have to really summarize what's the geopolitical issue at the heart of the European Union, it is that we have 40% youth unemployment in countries like Italy. 40% of the kids under 25, not only not employed, but not ever being employed. And this is not just a local issue. It's an issue that spreads across all of the European Union. So it becomes geopolitical in the sense that, you know, the Macron win is seen as a victory in geopolitics, right? Because it sets the stage and the tone. But we'll see, at the end of the day, governments have to be much more entrepreneurial in how they resolve the debt problem. And I will say they are being, and we should keep our eyes open. I'll give you just a tiny example because I think it's a fun one. But, you know, in the United States, they've legalized marijuana in many states. Now, do you think this is because everybody woke up one morning and said, I've changed my morals? No, it's because if you make it legal, you can tax it. So now we got revenue. So, okay, governments are having to be entrepreneurs as well. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin, just staying with the U.S. for a second. So what should people be concerned about? Are there issues that are looming that, from a business perspective, we should be worried about and focused on right now?
Sure. I mean, look, I mean, you know, the market obviously has been going up partially because they were excited about, you know, getting taxes cut, infrastructure spending, and deregulation. But if there's one thing the markets love as much or nearly as much as that kind of action, is absolutely no action in Washington, right? And I think we have to keep our eyes open that that is, in fact, a lot of what's happening. The legislative agenda of this administration is in jeopardy of getting effectively nowhere this year, which from a market's perspective is also kind of not that bad, really. You sort of know what the status quo is, and you can operate under that environment. I think that the issue here, though, is that, you know, the multinational corporation has thrived under this system that was designed by the United States and its allies coming out of World War II. And United States soft power really, you know, United States had power because it had hard power that nobody else has. That remains unquestioned, though we've seen disruption, as I mentioned, on that. It wrote really big checks around the world to coerce behavior, which it is to a great degree not doing anymore. And it had great moral authority, right? So a lot of what this president is doing, if you don't like it, actually it can get undone, right? Even pulling out of the Paris Accord, which doesn't actually go into effect until 2020, a new president could come in and by executive order put us right back in, and everybody around the world will go, oh, that was weird, and then kind of move on. But the question is, will the United States maintain its leadership position in this and be able to push its agenda, which is an agenda that basically corporate America and most of Western corporations, multinational corporations, operated under? Or are we going to be operating increasingly in a world where, say, the interests and objectives of China and the way that they see global organization being somewhat different, and we're going to have to alter how we do business and how we organize ourselves? That's the question.
I have to say, I actually see a few geopolitical deals on the landscape that will be very beneficial to businesses. One of them is an extraordinary alignment of the interests now between the United States and China regarding North Korea. And there are two issues there, just to be crystal clear. One is the nuclear threat, but the issue that really worries the region, and particularly China, is the potential for refugees. Because this is a country that doesn't have a sort of normal working population. This is a country with people who work in order to not be killed by the leadership. So I once spent 4 hours with Helmut Schmidt, who oversaw the reunification of Germany. And he was an advisor to the South Koreans. And he said, you got to understand, these people cannot be integrated into the economy like East Germans. East Germans understood. You go to work, you earn a paycheck, you use it to buy a beer. You go back the next day. This is not the situation here. And so the fact that the US and China are aligning about how to manage a potential refugee problem and how to diminish the nuclear threat, as I see that unfolding, I'm like, that's a buy story for the markets if we begin to remove that threat from the landscape. Similarly, what we're seeing in the Middle East right now, you mentioned the isolation of Qatar. Obviously, this is a live and very tricky issue, but what's the message? The message is that the United States, Israel, Saudi, and the whole Gulf are aligned, that they do not support anybody who provides financing for terrorism. It's kind of hard to argue with that, actually. And if they align to the point that they're willing to make these really significant commitments to that outcome, I mean, my guess is, and we were talking about this yesterday, my guess is Qatar is going to fold, right? They're going to agree we should stop handing cash over in this direction. That's a good story for the markets and for investors. Similarly, if we come to look at the European story, Brexit, in one sense, has forced the Europeans to really look hard at what is the nature of the project they're trying to achieve. And my personal view is that, and this is a very personal view, is that it's not that there's a problem with the European Union or the idea of a European project, it is the direction that they've chosen, which is a much bigger state with more onerous demands on businesses, with higher taxation, more regulation. And everybody is objecting to that precisely for the reasons you cite, that growth isn't high enough to justify all that. So if this starts to compel the Europeans to unwind a little of that, that's a buy story too. So these are all geopolitical stories in the news that basically say, this is all disaster. And I can see how all of them can end up in a much better place.
Can I push back just a little bit, though, on the China-U.S. front? And that is that I think that, 2017 is a little bit of a strange year. We've got a new administration coming in. I think one thing that's been extraordinary is that, when you went into the Mar-a-Lago summit between President Trump and Xi Jinping, there was a great deal of concern going into that because it was fraught with risk. And then actually it went off, all things considered, it went off very, very well. The other thing is that candidate Trump, transition Trump, and President Trump have said some things regarding China, with a phone call with the Taiwanese president, initial equivocation on the support for a one China policy and the like. China was amazingly restrained in their response to all of this. And the critical reason why, and this is why 2017 is a weird year, in this fall, there's going to be People's Congress in China where essentially they're going to determine the leadership for the next 10 years. And Xi Jinping is going to embark on the second half of his term. It is absolutely critical to him, because he wants to stack the leadership with his cadre of people, that this year go off without a hitch. He does not want to generate conflict, and he doesn't want to have something dislocating or destabilizing imposed on him. So they're it's very clear that they don't want to rock the boat. That will change in 2018. Similarly, for better or for worse, it is this presidential administration that is going to have to come to grips with the fact that North Korea is going to have not only a nuclear bomb that is miniaturized, they're going to have a delivery device that ultimately will be able to reach parts, at least, of the continental United States. It might not be that reliable, but it will happen. And the United States is going to have to decide whether this is something that they can live with or not, and what kind of action they're going to want to take. And this is the problem with North Korea. China and the United States have very different interests about where they want this ultimately to go. We ultimately support, the United States ultimately supports a reunification policy. China doesn't want that. Reunification essentially means South Korea winning, and that essentially means U.S. troops on the Chinese border. They are much more about status quo, but that ultimately, at some point, is going to become untenable, and there's going to be an action-forcing event here sometime in the next year or two.
And so as a business person, if you're doing business in this area, I mean, I guess, do you think there's a chance of war? I mean, it's in the paper more and more, so I'll ask the question.
Chance of war between the United States and China?
And North Korea.
Well, I
Let's
think,
hope not.
I think that that's relatively unlikely. One thing I would say is, what to sort of watch for, because sending a couple of aircraft carriers through the region or submarines through the region is not a precursor to military action on the Korean Peninsula. Taking action against Korea is not like taking action against Syria. You can't send a bunch of Tomahawks in there and call it a day and leave. And the problem is that North Korea is the DMZ is just far too close to Seoul. It's the most militarized place in the entire world. You have to be prepared for North Korean retaliation of some sort. And all-out retaliation on their part, it's estimated you could take out 200,000 to 400,000 people in Seoul in the first 48 hours of a conflict. So sending a few ships through the region is not a precursor to military action that has that kind of risk associated with it. You would need to see movements of U.S. troops into the Korean Peninsula and the removal of non-essential personnel, not only from the Korean Peninsula, but from Japan and from other areas in the region as well, and we simply aren't seeing that. But the risk here is very, very great, which is why I think we're not headed to a conflict anytime soon.
So I have to agree. I also don't see war in this instance. And I personally think the reason they've moved more of this infrastructure like the carriers in is, again, to deal with refugee-related problems rather than conflict. But I also think that there's an interesting phenomena here, which is, President Trump's attitude is, to many locations has been, hey, the U.S. doesn't have an interest. If you guys are interested, you have it. That's been his approach to Ukraine. That's been his approach to Syria. And I believe that is his approach to North Korea, which is, China, if you want it, you have it, because we're not interested any longer. This is a radical change in U.S. foreign policy. I also think that everybody's on high alert because the North Koreans have managed to move from liquid rocket fuel to solid. And that, it's too complicated to explain, but it has enormous implications for the speed at which they can move. And so it's become a more acute issue now. I also think it's important to pay attention to what's happening in the background. Who is appointed as the new U.S. ambassador to China? Governor Branstad. Why is he important? Because when Xi Jinping went to the United States to learn English as a teenager, he went to Iowa, and his best personal friend is Governor Branstad. So there's a direct channel there. I think also the Chinese, they like operating in a family context. And one of the ironies is that Americans find it very disturbing and unpalatable to see this president go around the world with his family, acting like it's a family business. But in fact, in the Middle East and China, they're like, yeah, that's how we do business too, right? They feel comfortable with this. So watch the dialogue between Ivanka Trump and the Chinese ambassador in Washington. I think the back channel activity here is just massive. So again, that's not a war scenario. And I think, look, General Mattis and General Kelly, these are incredibly thoughtful Marines. This is not a group of people who will stumble into conflict.
But this is where the rubber hits the road for entrepreneurs and for businesses, I think, which is that what Pippa is talking about is an increasingly transactional attitude on the part of the U.S. administration, which changes the dynamic under which countries are associating with each other, or at least the way the United States is associating with other countries, right? As opposed to taking a view on what the country's interests are in the long term and affecting policies to get there. Now, one could argue whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly, in the climate change issue and the withdrawal from Paris, I think one could argue that it may not be moral to take an attitude that is strictly looking at your own national interests. If you are the Maldives, which is a tiny little country that is effectively dependent on tourism for business, and yet you have an existential threat because in 100 years you might not exist anymore, to the extent that they've set up a sovereign wealth fund to buy land to repopulate outside of the Maldives because of global climate change and rising sea levels, that's not through their doing. We have imposed that upon them, right? So, this kind of collective action is something that ultimately might be required. We might have to get back to, but at the moment, we're heading toward a more transactional environment.
The other piece of the puzzle is what is called now the Arc of Steel. The Arc of Steel is Russia's strategy for dealing with the West. And it involves the build-out of physical military bases from the Arctic. You should Google something called the Arctic Shamrock, which I find fascinating. It's a very large military base that's just been completed in the Arctic. The Chinese and the Russians are both competing for dominance in the Arctic, not just because it has minerals and resources, but protein. In a world where we have protein shortages or high protein prices, you know what you got in the Arctic is a lot of fish. And they say that's funny, but the Russians have been paying 50% of their income on food alone. This is a very important driver for geopolitics. What happens to food prices? So we go from the Arctic into the Baltic. We see lots of military incidents between NATO and Russia in the Baltic. We go down through the borders of Western Europe. The Russians have announced they want a permanent naval presence in the Mediterranean. They are present and doing military exercises in places like Libya and Egypt, around places we haven't heard of since the Second World War, like El Alamein. And naturally, they are very involved now in Syria. One could effectively say Syria has become a Russian almost protectorate in a sense. So this is a big change on the strategic security landscape. And the question I have for you know, entrepreneurs, particularly ones doing business in Eastern Europe, is how that begins to impact. You know, what are the bigger implications? And it comes to your view, as you mentioned, Kevin, about what kind of rule system have we got? Is it the old one where it was US dominated, US dollar based, World Bank, IMF type institutions that underpinned it? Or are we leaning more towards a world where Russia and China introduce new currencies, and they have been forcing transactions increasingly in renminbi and yuan and Russian currency on the countries they do transactions with. And they're building their own institutions. So I come back to One Belt, One Road, which is underpinned by a brand new institution called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It opened for business in May with a balance sheet that is bigger than the World Bank on the first day of operation. So I ask you, you know, in geopolitics, does this matter? I'd say yes, because every country is going, I think I'd like to belong to that. Thank you, I'll sign up for that. And now we do have a competition of systems. This is a very important issue for entrepreneurs everywhere to decide what kind of system will they choose to operate in. And maybe the last layer of that is also we're in a world where people are nervous about currencies and government commitments to their currencies, and this leads to the demand for Bitcoin. This is another big question for entrepreneurs is what do you want to transact in? And I would say maybe the biggest geopolitical thing I see on the landscape that nobody talks about is that every government everywhere wants to move away from cash money to electronic money and using blockchain. And what that means is a world where state borders don't have the meaning that they used to have. So it's a massive geopolitical event. It also means incredible transparency. It means the end of the black market because there can't be a transaction that isn't visible to the blockchain. Now, is that good for you as an entrepreneur? Is that bad for you as an entrepreneur? We've got a lot of black market economies around the world that form the majority of GDP for many emerging markets. That's a big transition they're going to have to go through. I think most of them want to go through that transition, but now maybe we have the avenue, the pathway by which it can happen.
Yeah, your audit guys are going to have to really adjust to that.
Yeah, this is a big issue.
Well, we're going to be replaced by robots, so it's okay. So let me, you know, Pippa, you mentioned Brexit. We've been talking for a while here, and we really haven't talked about Europe and Brexit and the implications there. And I want to talk about that, then go into some predictions, because this is a panel on 2018. But Kevin, you want to talk about Brexit and what you're seeing out there and the implications for companies?
Sure. I just want to respond to one thing that Pippa said. I mean, you know, it's very easy to kind of get down on the United States and its position right now and what it's doing, but, you know, the assumption also is that there's going to be almost flawless execution on the part of the Chinese and the part of the Russians and so on and so forth. We're taking advantage of this dislocation and this disruption right now to further their agendas, but they've got massive challenges as well. China's got massive demographic, massive environmental problems, and remains an autocratic state with all the implications that has for entrepreneurs. And Russia, of course, you know, Putin is maybe the most super empowered individual in the world in many ways, and he operates by the dictum of, you know, as long as you're pushing and it's mushy, you keep on pushing until you hit steel, and nobody's putting any steel up. But the reality of it is he hasn't diversified his economy. You know, for a major superpower where life expectancy for a male has got like a late 50s handle on it in a world where, you know, you should be having an 80 or 90 handle on it, it says something. So I think that I think that we shouldn't assume that these guys are going to be able to execute on everything to get their agenda through. And the United States is not going to get its act together. This administration is still coming together and formulating what its real positions are, et cetera. And so we shouldn't straight line all of this. Now, as far as Brexit is concerned, obviously today is the UK general election. I think that only represents risk for Theresa May. You know, if it is proven that she made a mistake in calling this election, but even if she's as successful as she hopes and remains with, you know, and ends up with a 50+ seat majority in the House of Commons, I don't think that really matters one iota in Brussels or in Berlin in terms of their negotiations. What she has accomplished and what was important is that she has pushed out by another 2 years the need to hold another general election, which is critical because Brexit will go into effect in 2019. There would have had to have been a 2020 general election in the UK. And, you know, UK politicians have not been honest with the electorate in the UK about this trade-off between reclaiming sovereignty, essentially limiting free migration into the country, and its access to the free market. And there are big trade-offs coming, and you know, and essentially that's going to be a big wake-up call for the population. Now, one thing that's interesting is that it's kind of like, it's heartwarming to see that Brexit has actually unified the rest of the European Union. They're taking a very, very unified stance at the moment, and even more so since the election of Macron, who has aligned himself very closely with Merkel. But let's be very clear, this is masking still some very, very deep fissures that have not been resolved in European politics, and that the European project remains an incomplete one. You know, the elections that we have seen this year in the Netherlands and now in France, and increasingly as we've looked at the regional elections in Germany, it appears that Merkel, although it's unclear what her coalition will actually wind up looking like, she will be a chancellor for the 4th time in Germany. I don't think there's much of a question about that. But political fragmentation in Europe is here. It's here to stay. We are going to see, you know, sort of marginal right-wing parties in particular continue to dominate the political narrative and be able to affect change without actually winning elections. Remember, UKIP in the UK was able to affect its -- objective, which was getting the UK out of the EU. They had 1 seat in Parliament. The AfD in Germany got Merkel to do a 180 on her migration policy. And in places like Hungary and Poland, you are seeing policies being put in place that are completely out of whack with effectively what's the organizing principle of the European Union right now. So I think that there are great challenges ahead for Europe. This year is not the Brexit negotiation year until, you know, we had to get through the Article 50 declaration, the UK election, and most importantly, the German election. This is a 2018 story, and it's going to be extremely noisy as we know.
Pippa, other 2018 stories that you think will be of most interest to this audience?
Well, I think, coming back to Brexit for a moment, let's understand the populist forces that are giving rise to this, that everybody seems to think are local in their community. They don't appreciate these are global in nature. And what causes it? I come back to the debt burden, because it means that we can't meet everybody's needs. And the moment you can't, you start to say, well, hey, how come some of my wealth is going to that guy? And the next question is, wait a minute, why are you in charge? And that why are you in charge is what gave us the Arab Spring. It's what gives us Brexit. Frankly, in the United States, we have a record number of signatures on the petition for Texas to separate from the United States. Now, it's not going to do it, but it's interesting to watch the rise in the sentiment. And other states like California, the state of Maryland, all petitioning for, you know, potentially different sovereign structures. This is, again, a global phenomena, and I think it will persist until we have people feeling they are better off. Now, we could talk about the economic outlook, but when we come to this, again, issue of the balance of power between the state and the citizen. And I think one of the issues for the British was, you know, the Europeans had put on the table full harmonization, and this is relevant for this particular audience, full harmonization of corporate bankruptcy, employment, and sort of company law. And it wasn't the British version that was going to be imposed, since we're here in Monaco, on the French. One understands it was more the French version that was going to be imposed on the British. And that version of capitalism, while it might work fine in France, it's not the version of capitalism that works fine in America or in Britain or in lots of other places, frankly, not even in Germany. So what we're seeing is an argument about what is the nature of the version of capitalism that we all want. So that sets the stage for then 2018. And I think what we're witnessing is a renegotiation of the social contract between citizens and their states about what is the version of capitalism that we want. And as they do that, I think that's going to create a more stable, solid environment. But it's bumpy along the way. So for example, these upcoming municipal elections, I think we're going to see the return of the nationalist movement in France. They are not down and out for the count. They are still in play. Frankly, as you say, the AfD, we see record high popularity for the five-star movement in Italy. This is going to remain until people feel better off. And that's why I come back to keep your eyes open for deals. The governments are cutting deals with their citizens in lots of different ways. Trump is doing it in the US. China is doing it and through their One Belt, One Road. In the Middle East, we've certainly seen the leadership everywhere say, you know, the old system where all the wealth went to a few people and everybody else got nothing? That doesn't work anymore. We're going to share it around. This is why we see countries like Saudi saying we're going to do everything possible to support a much more entrepreneurial environment and create businesses. You may or may not have confidence in their capacity to deliver on this promise, but I think the fact that they are trying sets a stage that makes me very positive for 2018. Add to that we're right on the, well, I think we're already into the next major industrial revolution. Okay. That's important.
Look, between the invention of the internal combustion engine and basically Henry Ford perfecting the supply chain, you know, in about a 30-year period, the population of horses in the United States declined by 90%. We just didn't need them anymore. The problem is that horses, of course, they can't revolt and they can't vote, but workers can. And that's what we're seeing, because globalization has been, in many ways, the greatest force of good in world history in terms of bringing down poverty, in terms of bringing down childhood mortality and maternal mortality, bringing global health around the world, and spreading wealth. And we have seen the greatest contraction of inequality between countries in history. But we are seeing a greater increase in inequality within countries. And this is creating great consternation amongst the middle classes, and they are, out of fear, starting to push back. So this concept of who these workers are, what they're going to do in the future, how we're going to take care of them, these are questions that I think entrepreneurs, if they can answer them, because government isn't coming up with the answers right now, right? If you can arbitrage that, there's enormous opportunity, not only in the United States, but frankly, globally.
Entrepreneurs are the answer.
Thank you. Hey, this is great. We're out of time. Thank you, panel. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.